Two folks we wanted to make this presentation to have had to go back to Seabrook tonight, so they aren't here. But a couple months ago, Anne Marie Marshall called and said, you know, when I was raising money for, I think it was Independence Square project in Philadelphia, I found people that would sponsor things, and I think it's time that somebody sponsored a mural for you. So I would like to sponsor a mural for Don. Well, what evolved was that they both sponsored it for each other as their Valentine gift to each other. And they said, you know, if we do this as outsiders, surely the local folks will see the need and the good that's coming from the program, and they'll step up and we'll set the pace for them. So we have a picture of the mural on McLeod Grocery Store in Paxville. If you haven't seen it, it's over there. And the little sign will say, during the American Revolution, November 1780, Colonel Tarleton and his Green Dragoons hunted General Marion. Marion and his militia departed from Richburg's Mill, fought a series of delaying actions and rode to the head of Jacks Creek and then down to the Pocatalico River. The rest you pick up from our first mural on the fire station in Manning, where the Swamp Fox got his name. Our thanks to Don and Anna Marie Marshall of Silver Lakes Plantation for donating the Swamp Fox mural in Paxville. So. Okay. When we were coming up with what we were going to do tonight for the theater, it was suggested that we do John Rutledge. And what a tremendous idea. Because here was a gentleman that truly had just a terrible task. He barely escaped from Charleston. He had no government. He had a bunch of wild men out there running around in the swamps calling themselves militia leaders. And he had to bring this whole thing together. And he had no headquarters to go to. You know, he was just on the run. And so to introduce this and set the scenario for you, we have that lady that's famous across the stage and the screens of the world, on videos, and publisher of 3, soon to be 4 books, Dr. Christine Swager.
We've been hearing about the military leaders of the revolution, and so tonight, and we've not heard anything about a politician until tonight. Let me read this quote. The most gifted and devoted leader of the ruling group of the 18th century South Carolina, John Rutledge embodied, perhaps more perfectly than any other man, the ideas of his class. Now, as George said, the seat of government was in Rutledge's saddle, and the affairs of the state were conducted from the papers in his saddlebag. Tonight, we have, for your pleasure, a presentation by Governor Rutledge himself. And our visitor is brought to us by the artistic and scholarship of one of our own. Those of you who were here other years know Dr. Joseph Stukes as Francis Marion. Tonight, he will be Governor Rutledge. Dr. Stukes is retired from Francis Marion University. Isn't that appropriate? And he is a professor emeritus of history. Now, he's appeared in many venues as many historic personages. He's a regular on the Chautauqua circuit, where he has enlightened and delighted many people who love their history. Now, Governor Rutledge appears here in his later years, and he will reminisce about his career. I should warn you that in the last years, he showed signs of insanity and was forced by his derangement from public life. Now, you people in the front should not be afraid, because although Governor Rutledge may be a bit peculiar, he is not dangerous. So let me introduce to you Governor John Rutledge of South Carolina.
I'm glad to see you all here. They told me that you would come, and they wanted me to help remember about the year 1780. Well, sometimes these days it's difficult for me to remember. But I think I remember 1780. These days, I do not function as well as I did. People say that I am eccentric and that I am forgetful and that I am sometimes guilty of macabre things. But I was not always old, nor was I always forgetful, nor did I always do macabre things. I was born here in Charleston, 1739. Don't know which day, maybe today, 1739. And here it is in 1800. We want to talk about 1780. Well, I was 40 then. Of course, I'm 60 now. Before I was 40, though, I had been born into a good family here. My parents had 7 children in their 10 years of marriage. I was the oldest. My brother Edward, he's 11 years younger than I. He was the last of the children, of course. When I grew up and married, my wife and I had 10 children, 8 of whom survived. Even though my father was dead, my mother, who was wealthy in her own right, plus the wealth that my father had accumulated, plus the benevolence of an uncle, there was plenty of money. They sent me to England. I studied law over there. I studied in the inner temple, Inns of the Court. I was a serious student. And I was very, very much a pleasure to my professor. I also loved the theater. I attended frequently. And I particularly liked the actor David Garrick. David Garrick was popularizing an English playwright who had lived a century and a half before, William Shakespeare. And I went frequently to the theater to see the Shakespeare plays, both at the Globe and at the Downtown Theater that Garrick popularized himself. But when I finished, instead of staying in England and practicing law in England, I came back to Charleston. Almost immediately, I had more law practice than I could handle. I was well trained. As a matter of fact, there was no other lawyer in all of Charleston as well trained as I. And my mind was a logical mind. I never forgot anything. I was always ready. And I won practically all of the suits. After a couple of years, I decided to marry. I married Elizabeth Grimke. We decided one day to marry, and we stopped by St. Michael's Church. And we spoke to the priest, and he married us. He had 2 of his servants to be witnesses. And then I carried Elizabeth to the home where my mother lived to introduce her to my mother as her daughter-in-law. And it made my mother furious. She had planned that her eldest son would have the most gala of all the weddings Charleston had ever seen. And here I suddenly appeared, already married. I think my mother never really forgave me that. As I told you, Elizabeth and I had 10 children. The oldest one is John Jr. The youngest daughter, Sarah later married the son of my best friend, Henry Lawrence. Married Henry Jr. My friend Henry had a tragedy in his life that his second son, whom he had named Henry, had died as a child in a foolish prank, childhood prank, leaping from the roof of one building to the roof of the other building. And his foot slipped and he fell to his death. And so when the next son was born in the Lawrence family, he too was named Henry. And that's the one who became my son-in-law. It's been a great joy to have the families connected. Another one of my sons married a pink name. And so the families sort of all got connected. But I was the one who went into politics early. I thought it was my duty. It's the civic virtue, the duty to serve the community, to serve the area, to serve the state. And so I was elected to the legislature. And then in 1765, when Parliament over there in England passed the stamp tax, which meant that they would tax the colonies without their consent, I felt that my right as an Englishman was being violated. And it was my civic duty to help with the protest. I went to the Stamp Act Congress, sent there by the people of Charlestown. I was the youngest man ever. I was still in my 20s when I went to the Stamp Act Congress. And I was one of those who helped draft the document that we sent to the King and to Parliament, protesting the fact that they were violating our rights as Englishmen by passing direct taxes upon us when we were not represented in the taxing body. I was pleased when, although the stamps were here, although the stamps were in Charleston, we were able to hide those stamps. We never sold them in Charleston. And then we heard that the Stamp Act had been rescinded. We had considerable trouble with the King's government in Charleston. The King would send us governors who were unsympathetic with our way of life, unsympathetic with the problems of living in a colonial area. Our only weapon was to withhold the salary of the King's governor. And this we did until occasionally the governor would cooperate with us as we thought he should. The only weapon we had then was withholding the salary. When the tea came in 1773, it was a real problem for us. We didn't know whether to land that tea or not. We knew what had happened in Boston. The news came quickly. And I was afraid that we might engage in Charleston in a rash act, as they had done in Boston. It was on my suggestion that we landed the tea, but that we stashed it all in the basement of the Exchange building in Charlestown and sold not a bit of the tea, so that the problem about, again, being taxed and taxed on the basis of tea was solved. And I was one of those who rejoiced when, after things had fallen apart and there was war between the colonies and Great Britain, that then we sold the tea as a charity. As the proceeds, we bought powder and ammunition, and we sent that to the British in return. We also sent, shortly after the tea tax, and Parliament had passed the Boston Port Bill, which closed the port of Boston and threatened that great city with starvation. We sent produce. We sent supplies. We were the first colony to send supplies to Boston. We sent them by ship, and we aided Massachusetts in its time of trouble. Cooperation between the colonies. It later bore fruit for us, but we had first been the one to collaborate. When in 1775, the First Continental Congress was called, I was elected as one of the delegates. I went. I found that there were radicals up there, radicals who were ready to go for independence. Well, I was opposed to what Britain was doing, but I was an Englishman. I was a great admirer of the British way of life. I didn't want independence. I wanted my rights as Englishmen. And so I helped frame, once more, a petition. This one sent both to the Parliament and to the King, reminding them that they were overstepping the rights of those of us who lived in the colonies. It was a moderate document, not a radical one. My friend Christopher Gadsden was furious with me. Gadsden was a radical. ready to do what he wanted to do. My new friend Henry Lawrence, a man who took care of my business affairs in great amounts. Henry Lawrence was like I was, not ready for independence, but certainly ready to protect our local rights. And when we heard that they had been actually fighting in Massachusetts, up there in Concord, Massachusetts, and in Lexington, Massachusetts, there in the Continental Congress, it was time for us to find someone who could rally what militia we had to form them into an army, to give armed resistance to the British, who would not heed our pleas for mercy and for justice. I was one of those who, in conjunction with others, suggested that we name George Washington to be our commander-in-chief. Mr. Washington accepted that position. And as you will remember, he was our commander-in-chief throughout the war. I wasn't there the day the Declaration of Independence was signed. My brother was, Edward, my youngest brother. Other people were friends of mine. I heard about it when I was in Charlestown. And I will confess that I shed a tear of deep regret. It meant that we cut the ties with the greatest empire in the world. Probably greater than the empire of the Romans 1,800 years ago. It seemed to me that we ought to be able to get along. But on the other hand, experience showed us that we were not going to get along. That the Parliament, which should be our friend, our father, our mother, our helping brother, was indeed totally cold to the needs of the colonies. They looked upon us not as citizens of the empire, but as workers for the empire. And they expected the wealth that we produced to go not to ourselves and not to the empire as a whole, but to England. So I didn't sign the Declaration. I wish we hadn't had it. But once it was signed, it was my duty, of course, to follow along. The king had announced that we as colonies were in rebellion. King George III had called us rebels. I didn't think we were rebels. I thought we were citizens of the empire who were protesting wrongs. And all we wanted to do was to set the wrongs right. But after the Declaration of Independence, and after the king announced that we were rebels, we needed to make our own government. Following the suggestion of the Continental Congress, we had a convention in our state, and we established a Republic of South Carolina. A republic. The Constitution of 1776. We met in convention. We wrote as a convention a constitution. We said that the people would elect a lower house, and the lower house would elect an upper house, and that the two houses together would vote to choose a president and a vice president. There were 5 names suggested. And the rules that we had set up said that the one who had the most votes would be the president, and the one who had the next most votes would be the vice president. And all those who were voting aye received 162 votes. My friend Henry Lawrence received 160 votes. And so we were president and vice president of the Republic of South Carolina. But we had said in the document itself, in the preamble, that this would be a temporary government. Temporary government, until we could settle the differences. But the differences did not go away. We were not able to settle the differences. 2 years later, it was beyond recall. Within those 2 years, they had been fighting not only in Massachusetts, but fighting along the coast, and the fighting in Sullivan's Island. I was the president of South Carolina. General Washington, on his behalf, had sent a General Lee, a General Charles Lee, who had experience as a British general, who came with the greatest of credentials. And Charles Lee came down to Charlestown to help us defend ourselves. And, of a certainty, the fleet came. The British fleet. They were ready to take Charleston by sea. We had a half-finished fort on Sullivan's Island. General Lee sent word to my boyhood friend, William Moultrie, sent word to William Moultrie to destroy the fort and fall back. And when I heard that that had been done, I just could not see how that was right. And so I, as president of South Carolina, sent the message to William Moultrie, do not fall back. Complete the fortifications there. And if the British try to attack, defend. Well, the British did try to attack. They tried to attack by land, and because of the lack of maps, they ended up in the swamps. They were unable to come from Long Island across to Sullivan's Island, and so they tried to come by ship. They tried to bombard the fort. They did bombard the fort, but the fort stood. And the fort returned fire and damaged several of the British ships and sank one. The young man who commanded the artillery was a young farmer whose name was Francis Marion. And he commanded that artillery with great skill, conserving his ammunition and finding excellent aim. And when one of the British shells hit the staff on which our flag, our blue flag, with a rising crescent moon on it, and that flag hit the ground, this young man, William Jasper, leaped across what protection there was from the palmetto logs, took the flag, and fastened it high again. And after the battle, I sent a hogshead of rum to the men, and I sent my own sword as a reward to William Jasper. And it was a disappointment when, but a few weeks later, William Jasper, now a sergeant, was killed in fighting in Savannah. I had much trouble with Charles Lee. Charles Lee had come with all the reputation, but all the military orders that he'd given seemed to me to be wrong. And even though he had the reputation of a military man, and of course I had never been on the battlefield before in all my life, but I was the president of the Republic, and so I countermanded him. We didn't get along at all. As a matter of fact, Charles Lee went back, and as you may remember, he and George Washington didn't get along at all. In 1778, that is, after 2 years as the president of the Republic of South Carolina, we realized that independence was a fact. It was time for us to establish not a temporary republic, but establish a government in which we would cooperate with the other colonies as one of the states to be united together in our resistance to the British. So in 1778, the legislature that had been created by the Constitution of 1776 wrote a constitution in which they established us as a state and created the office of governor. I pondered over that. As a lawyer, I realized that the legislature has no right to write a constitution. It takes a convention of the people. It's not that the people's representatives who are elected to act on all measures affecting the state. Constitutions have to be written by conventions who are elected for the sole purpose of writing a constitution. And even though I was the president of the Republic, I found that I needed to veto and challenge. There was no veto available. And so when I addressed the legislature, and I said to them, you are the provincial Congress. You are not a constitutional convention. And since I cannot stop you any other way, I offer my resignation. And it stunned them. they turned to Arthur Middleton. And Arthur decided that he would not accept the job as president or as governor of the new state. And then they turned to Rutledge Lowndes, and Mr. Lowndes accepted. I went back, as a matter of fact, I came back to this very house. Elizabeth and I had built this house on Broad Street, number 116. The best house on Broad Street in Charleston. I resumed my practice of law. It was almost more than I could handle. As my friend Henry Lawrence was at work at 5 a.m. every day, so was I at work at 5 a.m. every day. I did a great amount of work. I piled up a great amount of credits. Not money, credits. And with those credits, I bought a good bit of land. As a matter of fact, at the height, I owned 173,000 acres of South Carolina land. A good bit of it around Charleston. I owned 29 lots in Charleston City. The rest of it scattered throughout the low country, but also some land up in the 96th district. We anticipated the expansion of the state. Well, I knew it from the start. Mr. Lowndes was a vacillator. He never could quite make up his mind. And particularly in crises, Rutledge Lowndes just never knew what to do. And after he had stumbled along as the governor of the state for 11 months, he resigned. We had a new election. Altogether, in the combined houses, there were 163 votes. And I received 154 votes. And so I became the governor of South Carolina. 1778. 1778. And you wanted to talk about 1780. It came quickly. It was the worst year for the colony of South Carolina, for the Republic of South Carolina, and for the state of South Carolina. In May, despite the fact that General Washington had sent us a new leader, a better leader than Lee, in my opinion, but who was not better, in my opinion. His name was Benjamin Lincoln, a big man from Massachusetts, a man who in battle had already been wounded, and he limped on his left leg. He had been on the battlefield. His courage was not questioned. His bravery was not an issue. What was an issue was the fact that he had his ideas about the military, but he listened too much to the non-military people, to the social leaders of Charlestown. And when the British came, not by sea this time, but by landing south of Charleston and moving from island to island in amphibious landings, moving up from Hilton Head and moving across to get into Charlestown itself. They were also coming from the west, overland. Time ran short. General Lincoln finally said he thought we ought to abandon Charleston, move into the interior, and to have our defense rather than being cooped up in a port city. But when that word got out, the people of Charlestown insisted that he stay and fight and save the city. Altogether, we could muster maybe as many as 4,000 men. Most of these were farmers who had come as militia, not as trained soldiers. So General Lincoln had only about 2,000. But against that 4,000, the British had at least 9,000. And they had the powerful guns that were on the ship. They bombarded us from sea as they advanced by land. My own house was hit, there on Broad Street. We ran out of food. We ran out of food for the soldiers, but also for the civilians. I finally had to sign the order, hated to do it, I signed the order that said that the Army could go into a private house and take what food or supplies were available within the private houses. It was a desperate situation. And then, in 1780, just as the last opportunities for flight were closing, General Lincoln suggested that I, as the governor of the state, leave Charlestown. Well, I thought that the governor of the state should not be captured by the enemy. But I also did not want to leave what looked to me like a hopeless situation. Of course, facing perhaps imprisonment as a captive of the enemy. And so I refused to leave at first until he was able to find his other commanders. And he drafted a letter and had them all sign, pleading with me to leave Charlestown and to carry on the government in the rest of the state of South Carolina. Faced with such an appeal, I agreed to go. Only 4 of us went. We slipped through the lines. We were fortunate not to be captured. One of those who went was my brother Edward. Others, one Pinckney, one UG, and the 2 of us Rutledges. And then, almost for the next 2 years, I was on the move. At first I came to Orangeburg, second city in the province. And I thought, surely I could organize things in Orangeburg. Well, the people came out. But there was great resistance for folks in South Carolina who, facing the danger of the British government's forces, realized that South Carolina is a colony, fighting almost by itself. No help from North Carolina, no help from Virginia, no help from New York, no help from Massachusetts, fighting against the greatest government in the world with a powerful fleet and a just as powerful an army. And so I was not able to raise many recruits. In fact, a great number of the people in the colony, having given up hope of independence, flocked back to the British crown. They began to fly the British flag over their houses. Many of them had gone and signed documents. Those who had been captured in Charlestown, when finally that city fell, many of them signed paroles to say that they would not fight again. Later, some of them said, although not all of them, they would not only not fight against the Americans, they would fight for the British. Not just staying neutral, but actually fighting for the British. The British demanded that. And some people agreed. Not all. Not only did Charleston fall, but a few months later, in Camden, which was another one of the major cities, which the British had picked, in a battle in Camden, a terrible battle. General Washington had sent General Gates down to defend Camden. General Gates came with all the reputation of having been the victor at Saratoga. He came with all of the announcement as to what he was going to do. He had with him another general, a German, de Kalb. I had never met de Kalb, but I came to realize that he was probably the best of the generals in South Carolina at the time. But the commanding general was Gates. And in a terrible battle in August of this crucial year, 1780, Gates's army was decimated, badly defeated and scattered. Gates himself fled the area. And so we had lost 2 armies, one in Charlestown, one in Camden. And there were other battles round about. There was one general named Sumter who had gone up to Fishing Creek, and he was going to fight, and he tried to fight, and he was badly defeated again. It was a dark, dark time. Frankly, a lesser man than I would have been ready to quit. Added to the problem was the rumor that kept coming back, and that is that the Continental Congress up there in Philadelphia, that Continental Congress was ready to turn the 3 lower colonies back to England. That is to give us South Carolina and also Georgia and also North Carolina back as colonies to England in order for the rest of the colonies to be independent. I heard this rumor, as did others. I even wrote the Continental Congress and said, you need to make some statement about this. Frankly and gratefully they did. They denied that there was any such plan to cut the colonies in any way and give some of them back without question to the British. But it was unnerving. But one thing that came, there was a bright light among all the darkness of 1780. And that was this man that I had once commended for his action in the Battle at Sullivan's Island, in what we now had begun to call Fort Moultrie. In that battle back in '76, Francis Marion had been the artillerist. And he, after having recovered from an unfortunate accident where he had badly damaged his legs, which incidentally were never strong anyway, probably from birth, his ankles had been weak and malformed. Francis Marion looked anything but like a general. His arms were a little too long, reaching close to his knees. He had a hawk nose. He was not as tall as most people. He was of lesser stature than most. And he was slender. He looked like anything but a gentleman. But there was something about Francis Marion that made men rally to him. He had had experience, which other men knew, which he himself never trumpeted about, as did General Gates, for instance, and as did General Lee. But Francis Marion was able to get a few people. The first thing that he did to bring some ray of sunshine into the life of the state of South Carolina in 1780 was to intercept a group of British soldiers who were transferring prisoners that they had taken at Camden down to Charlestown. Marion, hearing of it, surprised them near Nelson's Ferry, sent the British running, captured some, and turned loose the 150 men. But there was a dark side to this new ray of sunshine. Of those 150 men, Marion gave them a choice. Either go back home and quit the war, or go on to Charleston and be a prisoner. And another month or so down at Black Mingo Swamp. He didn't surprise them, but he outfought them. A group of some British, but mostly Tories, under the command of a man named John Cumming Ball, a cousin of my friend Henry Lawrence. Ball escaped by running into the swamp, and he left his horse, which Marion took for his own. The Big Red, Marion named him Ball, rode him to the end of the war. Prisoner of war. Marion never had any men, but you know, he was not really an army man. He never had any real training as an army man. The same thing was true of Thomas Sumter, who, because his own house had been destroyed, took it personally and began to fight back. Sumter didn't win many battles, but he fought them, and he kept the British nervous. Marion won more battles, but they were always small. Marion never had really more than 50 men or so, and occasionally when the time was ripe and he had sent out commands and pleas for men to join him, maybe he would get up to 100, maybe even 150, not much more ever. And he would hit and run. That's the only way we could beat the British, but that's the way we beat them. All the way through 1780. So that at the end of 1780, while the job was not yet done, things looked very, very good for South Carolina. As a matter of fact, early in 1781, Marion went on at Fort Watson, captured Fort Watson, at Fort Mott, and again later with the help of a new general from the north, General Nathaniel Greene, the third general that George Washington had sent to us. And with that third general, we won at Eutaw Springs. Not a wonderful victory at Eutaw Springs, but a victory, a clear victory. Shortly after that wonderful year of 1780, the British now, instead of dominating Charlestown, Camden, and even 96, now they had withdrawn And they were occupying only enclaves, Georgetown, Charlestown, further south along the islands. The British, as we know, never got over it. 1780, we ought to celebrate 1780. We ought to celebrate its 100th anniversary. We ought to, in the future, celebrate its 200th anniversary, its 225th anniversary. This is when South Carolina did their share. Not only along the coast, but up at Cowpens, and later at Kings Mountain. And the British were gone, except around Charleston. It was 2 years from the time that the legislature had given me absolute power. They passed a resolution back there in 1780 that said that I would have the power to give any orders in South Carolina except to take the life of a citizen without a fair trial. I never did try to take the life of a citizen without a fair trial. I did order some trials. And I did try to answer the British in their own way. On one occasion, I even suggested, because of the horrendous things, the inhuman things that the British were transparently doing to our people, I did order that it would be possible to hang a British officer who was a prisoner for every house that was burned. It sometimes happened. It sometimes happened. Finally, late in 82, we were able to have a legislative meeting. We decided to meet in Jacksonboro, not far from Charlestown. We couldn't meet in Charlestown, the British were still there. But we met there in Jacksonboro, and with some more fighting, and with the fact that the British were losing now up around Boston and New York and the rest of America, and the fact that they grew tired of the war, we were finally able to make arrangements for the British to abandon Charlestown. They were able to take with them some of the loyalists who had fought with the British, and all the loyalist belongings. It took 300 British ships to take away the Tories that wanted to leave South Carolina. 300 ships. There were over 4,000 Tories who left. But now, South Carolina was a free and independent state. Some Tories stayed. And we decided that we needed to punish those Tories for what they had done during the war. Because some Tories had left, we confiscated some of the plantation. As a matter of fact, we confiscated 237 by name, and another 250 by category. The state now owned all this land. It was the way we paid a good many soldiers, by giving them the land. We didn't confiscate everybody's estate. We amherst some, as much as 12% of their total worth. 47 by name, 47. And about another 50 by category. And in this way, we tried to say that the war was over, the debts are settled. We also had to pass a law to give debt relief to those who had piled up debts during the wartime. And we passed one law that protected the soldiers, the general officers, in case they had committed some sort of crime during the war in the name of the war. General Sumter was delighted at that. General Sumter needed protection. I never had liked him. But he was in the field. Men were following him. And he had accomplishments. And so I had promoted him as a general. I had promoted him before I promoted Francis Marion, which caused a little problem between the two of them. Francis Marion didn't like Thomas Sumter either. Francis Marion didn't want to obey Thomas Sumter's orders, which Thomas Sumter was wont to give. We had difficulties settling, but we did. I returned to Charlestown. I served out my term as governor. I was unable to succeed myself after the 2 years. One of my friends, John Matthews, was elected as the governor. I was pleased. I later entered the lower house elected from Charlestown. I also went back to practicing law. Once more, I made a lot of money on paper, but I owed a lot of money on paper. I was even sued by people in Charlestown to collect the debts that I owed them. It was an embarrassing situation. Embarrassing. But the Articles of Confederation that we were living under as a government didn't protect us. It was obvious we needed a better government than we were having, with each individual state being individual, with its sovereignty intact. And so when a convention was called in 1787 to amend the Articles, that's what it said, amend the Articles, in South Carolina, we elected 5 persons to go to Philadelphia to this convention to amend the Articles. I was one of those elected. So was my brother, Edward. Arthur Middleton was elected. Thomas Ledge was elected. And my friend Henry Lawrence was elected. Henry, unfortunately, as he was on a diplomatic mission, had been captured at sea and had spent time in the Tower of London. So when the Constitution was finally written by this organization that was supposed to only amend the Articles, but presumed to write a new Constitution, Henry was not there to sign. We left a space for him on the Declaration for his name to be put, and it never was put. So 4 men from South Carolina, Middleton, Lynch, and Rutledge, signed the document. I was pleased to be very effective in that Constitutional Convention. I helped calm things, but I helped make sure that the Southern interests were protected. Charles Pinckney, who was also concerned, Charles Pinckney, who was also there, made suggestions about the Constitution. We finally got it done. We were satisfied now. We were now the United States. And the United States was promoting people. My name was suggested as a possible vice president, along with George Washington, whom everybody chose to be the president. Alas, there was a backstage politicking in Philadelphia and throughout the states. And it was suggested that since Washington was a Southerner, Virginia counted as one of the Southern colonies, now states, they needed someone from the North. And so the job of vice president went to John Adams. And so I said to my friend George Washington, reminding him that I was one of those who had him appointed as commander-in-chief in the first place a few years before, I suggested to him that I might enjoy being the Chief Justice of the United States Court. But alas, that had to go to a man from a middle state. And so they took John Jay for that. So I returned to South Carolina. I tried to pick up my life. My mother was still alive. We were living in this very house, 116 Broad Street. It had been damaged because British had lived here during the war, but my mother had been allowed to live in that house too. General Leslie, the British leader, had been kind to my mother. On the first occasion, when she came into the house where he had already taken it over, he offered her tea and she refused. He offered her wine and she refused. He offered her cognac and she accepted. I was named as a judge in South Carolina, but I declined, because even though the Chief Justice job in the federal government went to John Jay, my friend Washington appointed me as an associate justice. And so I was a judge of the Supreme Court, but not the chief of the very first Supreme Court. It meant that I had to ride circuit twice a year. And the circuit went all the way up to Pennsylvania and down into Georgia. It was time consuming. It was wearing. And so, after 2 years, I resigned as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court and took the job of Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. I had to ride circuit in South Carolina, but it was not so bad. I did not have the reputation of being punctual. And occasionally, in their power, a grand jury would even send presentments against the judge himself. But on one occasion, the grand jury presented me with the fact that I was not in the courtroom at 10 o'clock. And I called the grand jury together and I marched into the room and I let them know, gentlemen, it is never 10 o'clock until I am in this room. But my health began to fail. My mother and my wife died the same year, 1792. My mother died first, and my wife was not ill. But she collapsed so quickly. Yeah, almost to call it a sudden death. And those who had been my creditors in the past began to press upon me for payment. And it bothered me, it worried me. I couldn't sleep. I was unable to pay. I began to sell off my lands. And finally, my son, John, and my brother, Edward, came to me and made me sign a paper which gave them power of attorney over my holdings. And I grew sicker and sicker. And that's when they began to say that I was eccentric and that I was forgetful. For 3 years after my wife died, I lived alone, taken care of by house servant and slave. And then in 1795, in a bit of depression, I waded out into the Ashley River until it was over my head, and I intended to stay there. People along the shore saw they were black, and they fished me out of the river. They carried me to James Blake's house, and James and his family nursed me back to health. I found that I didn't have many lands left. And I didn't have any law practice anymore. And I found that I couldn't remember. Sometimes I couldn't remember John Jr.'s name. And I grew weaker and weaker. And I have lived in my memories. They're wonderful memories. 1780, among the others, is what you came to talk about. And I think that there are a few days left. After all, I'm 60. But in those few days, I'll remember the past days and give thanks for them and for tomorrow. God bless you and South Carolina.
Mr. President, sir, there are people here that fought with us during the Revolution who have ridden from Georgia and even Massachusetts to be with you and hear you tonight. Sir, would you entertain just a few questions before you retire?
First, I would like to salute them and all the others who spent those dangerous days in 1780, but in other days as well. And I salute you. So much for him. If anybody has a question they think I can answer.
We have one question over here, Dr.
Well, I'll
Stukes.
make sure I can answer it.
Yeah, I'm sure you can, sir, since it concerns you personally and immediately.
All right.
Before Charleston fell, there was another assault on the city a year earlier.
Yes?
At that moment, it appeared Charleston would fall, and you sent a message to the British commander offering to withdraw South Carolina from the war and remain neutral for the remainder of the war if they just leave Charleston alone.
Yes, they were well trained, and
Yeah, I know. I've never heard of it, but I like absinthe. Here goes, sir. Taxi.
Hello, Saul. Well, how are you doing over there? Well, we can get them the Luffy Grill, which is up front of the building.
Can I help you? I'm looking for Jonathan Devereaux.
Mr. Devereaux's out right now. He'll be back tonight for the party.
Well, is Maddie here?
I don't believe I know you, ma'am. Maybe you'd like to leave a message.
Go. It's down by the dock. Yeah.
Guest to the concierge here at the hotel.
Go right up and see
It's certainly a pleasure having you stay with us here at the Montanoni, Mrs. Scratch.
There. My suite has a view.
Your room has a lovely view of the Mississippi, Mrs. Scratch.
And I need a masseuse.
I'll send Jerome right up. Bruce? 1420, Mrs. Scratch. Hello.
I'm sorry, are you lost?
No, actually, I'm found. I just had an hour with Jerome.
Oh, Jerome. I've heard that he is marvelous.
He's fabulous. I haven't felt this good since the day my husband died. So I've got something for tonight, but I think I need Armani.
Yes, very good, Mrs.
Critch, suite 1420.
Of course.
I'll be charging it to my room.
Now, Mrs. Critch, I would say that you are a size 4?
A 2.
Of course.
Find out and get it right back to me, right?
I'm saying
There's a guy waiting for you.
yeah, they pulled that all out already.
That's all the paperwork on it, Brian. Doesn't it?
Did you catch that thing? What'd you use for bait?
I caught that big bucket mouth son of a bitch off an old rebel lure my daddy left me. Of course, there's buzz bombs, poppers, jigs, all kinds of things work back in these waters. I'm Jim Mangold.
Travis Lehman, Washington Department of Corrections.
What can I do for you? Who's this?
That's somebody I'm looking for.
Pretty girl?
Oh, yeah, she's very pretty for a convicted murderer.
Mr. Lehman, I'd love to be able to help you, sir.
No, I don't want you guys to go any trouble. I can handle matters. I just came down as a